I don't think most of us have positioned our portfolios well enough for what's coming over the next few years. There's a huge rotation happening in the markets right now that might not seem obvious at first, especially when you look at the S&P flirting with all-time highs. But if you look a little bit deeper, it feels like the leaderboard is starting to change. The year-to-date performance of some of these mega caps might be a canary in the coal mine that we should look out for. But we'll get to that later on in the video because there are other temporary and more unpredictable changes happening right now, such as the US-Iran conflict, with the US launching their operation dubbed Epic Fury that has already drawn neighboring countries into the war. And also, investors are wrestling with whether or not software is dead, as the threat of AI on software businesses is becoming more real. And if that wasn't enough, the world is slowly decoupling, with deglobalization and reshoring and national security reshaping the global economy, which means we could be looking at a whole new set of winners and losers over the next decade. So the real question becomes, how should you position your portfolios in this new world order? Unfortunately, there isn't going to be one perfect answer to this question. Investing really depends on your own personal circumstances and style, and whether or not you want to remain local. And by local, I do mean the US because I think that's where the majority of you, the viewers, are based. Or should you be exposed to international markets and the fluctuations in different currencies? But hopefully, this discussion will offer some guardrails so you don't end up on the wrong side of these changes and maybe even benefit from them. As you're all aware by now, the US-Iran war is in full swing. And I've personally felt the direct consequences of this war myself, because I live in Kuwait, and sadly, there were a number of people in my country who've lost their lives as a result of this conflict. And it's a really sad situation that really reminds you of the actual real world consequences of these events, as opposed to just the financial and market related ones. And I'm posting to this video to you today, but I don't know if in the coming weeks the situation worsens or escalates, whether or not I'll be able to keep making these videos honestly. So for now, I'm trying to keep level headed and keep doing what I'm doing day to day. And I'm going to try to avoid any political related comments, and we're just going to focus on the market related ones. What we've seen so far is that the VTI, the total stock market index, has remained relatively stable, currently down only about 3% since the start of the conflict. And the bond market has also been surprisingly calm, with yields sitting at around 4%. And normally in times of geopolitical stress, we'd expect to see investors rush to government bonds, pushing yields lower. But so far, that hasn't really materialized. However, if we look at the VXUS, which represents the total international stock market excluding the US, we see a weaker picture. The index is down roughly 7% over the same period, and there are several macro explanations for this. But one of the key drivers appears to be a flight to safety to the US dollar. Over the past few months, the US dollar has been weakening against other currencies. However, the onset of the latest conflict appears to have spooked investors and triggered one of the largest spikes in the dollar in nearly a year. And this has somewhat reversed the trend of the VXUS outperforming the VTI over the last 12 months. But that's a trend investors should probably keep an eye on, particularly because the US remains one of the most richly valued markets when you look at the cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio. The other notable turbulence in the market, as you might expect, is related to the oil prices, and Brent crude is up around 30% or so since the start of the war. And their initial estimates immediately at the start of the conflict was oil might hit $100, which I think we're almost there. But there are even further estimates for the price per barrel to hit $120 if this conflict extends for a prolonged period of time. So why is that? Well, a big reason is the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most critical choke points for moving oil and natural gas across the world by sea. And around 27% of oil and 22% of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, shipments flows through this. And many Gulf states, Kuwait included, have almost halted production. Qatar has already halted their LNG production, and they are one of the world's largest LNG exporters globally. And another less talked about point is the effect this war is going to have on global food supply. The Strait of Hormuz is the highway for around 30% of global urea supply, which is one of the most important materials needed to improve crop yields. And this extends also into sulfur, which is another essential nutrient for plants. So how you choose to play this is really up to you, whether it's to look for companies that will benefit as a secondary source of these supplies or avoiding this trade altogether. There's a lot of debate about the reasons for the war, and because this is obviously not a political channel, we're not going to go into the exact potential of various scenarios, but we're going to explore just one of these because we have some data to back this up. One of these scenarios was regarding the US trying to indirectly affect China's oil supply. And we can see here from the political charts that you could say roughly 50% of China's oil imports have been directly impacted as a result of the US actions if you include Venezuela as well. Data from JP Morgan's energy report shows us that while imports are vital for China, it only requires around 18% or so for its actual energy consumption. But the real issue for the global economy is how drawn out this war will be, with Donald Trump estimating that this Operation Epic Fury is going to take roughly 4 to 5 weeks, but I wouldn't hold my breath. And Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, expects the longer the war draws out, the more this will lead to an uptick in inflation. So how should you position your portfolio? Should you look to hold more cash or bonds, or less inflation sensitive assets? Well, what I would say is it's helpful to look at patterns in history to see how the previous conflicts affected the stock market. On average, from this chart, you can see that the maximum drawdown for any given year has been around 5%, with the bottom usually being reached 22 days after the start of the conflict. But if we look beyond drawdowns, there are instances, and a lot of them, where the stock market actually outperforms during a period of war and conflict, sadly, likely due to how far removed these businesses are from the actual implications of the war itself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the markets themselves have been flat or steady by any means. You get the sense sometimes that the stock market is currently playing with fire. And this is not me fear mongering or anything, but all it is looking through the data and seeing what it's telling us. And the volatility index, which measures obviously, well, the expected volatility in the market, has been spiking. And when it spikes to these levels, it is usually followed by a period of market weakening and drawdowns. But that doesn't seem to be happening yet. Looking at the data from Investor Sentiment Survey, the bulls and the bears appear to be canceling themselves out, and the market is fairly neutral. However, what we can see when we take a closer look at the top names in the S&P is what was highlighted earlier in the video. This chart shows us the returns of the Mag 7 year to date, and this is actually not what you'd expect. Given these companies make up around 30% of the S&P market capitalization, there's been a relatively large drawdown in the names like Microsoft, Tesla, and Amazon, and there might be several reasons for this re-rating. Some of it is clearly related to the capex spend by some of these major hyperscalers, and for other companies, it might just be a re-rating due to the elevated multiples you were paying for these businesses. Some interesting data by research affiliates actually breaks down some of these megacaps, or as they like to call them, conglomerates, into their individual business segments. What this chart shows us is that when you look at these businesses individually and compare their price to sales ratio, most of these segments are actually valued lower than the parent company as a whole. And that's true for Alphabet, Microsoft, and Apple. And based on this comparison, you could argue that Amazon appears to be the cheapest of this group. Also, one of the clearest signs of this rotation is what we're seeing here. Data from Citadel shows a sharp increase in dispersion within the S&P 500. And dispersion simply measures how widely individual stocks' returns differ from one another. And right now, they're saying that there's a 3 sigma event, essentially meaning a 99th percentile level of dispersion. And that helps explain why many of us are noticing so much more volatility in our own portfolios. On some days, 1 or 2 stocks might drop 10%, even when the overall market barely moves. It's hard to pinpoint one single event that's driving this rotation, but we can point to a few contributing factors. For one, many institutional investors appear to be shooting first and asking questions later, reacting to the recent wave of software is dead articles and narratives circling the market. As a result, software stocks have been under pressure for much of February. At the same time, capital has been rotating into areas like consumer defensives, which have actually outperformed the software sector over the past year. But it's not just consumer defensives. We're seeing similar strength in industrials, energy, and materials, along with several other cyclical sectors. While if you look at the worst performers year to date, that's technology, consumer discretionary, and financials. And we'll come back to technology and software in a bit, but first, let's quickly touch on why energy, materials, and industrials have been outperforming recently. And if we look at the dominant investment themes over the past 70 years, each decade can be defined by a specific market theme. In the 1950s and 60s, the Nifty 50 reigned supreme, as investors paid a massive premium for high-quality blue-chip growth. The 1970s, which was widely considered a lost decade for stocks and bonds, and also coincided with massive spikes in gold and oil prices. And you could argue that this environment isn't entirely dissimilar to what we may be heading into today. History, as they say, doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. And today we're once again seeing rising geopolitical tensions and persistent inflationary pressures. And with that said, there are also some important differences. Over the past few decades, we've seen the birth of the internet and the rapid expansion of global trade and the rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse. But the next decade, however, may look very different. Potentially, what could define it is reshoring, deglobalization, and national security priorities. And let's not forget about the ongoing breakthroughs in AI and the surge in infrastructure build-out. All the way back in 2014, Peter Thiel, one of the most prolific venture capitalists and co-founder of PayPal and Palantir, pointed out that society had been investing heavily into bits, but not nearly enough into atoms. In other words, most of the progress and innovation over the past few decades has taken place in the digital world as opposed to the physical one. But that may be about to change. Obviously, we're seeing a re-acceleration of investment in the infrastructure layer in orders of magnitude greater than anything over the past 30 years at least, particularly in things like data centers, energy systems, and semiconductor manufacturing. And to a certain extent, these large language models and AI infrastructure are now being viewed as strategic national assets that countries are trying to secure and control. And policies like the Big Beautiful Bill may help explain why sectors like energy, materials, and industrials have rallied so strongly recently, as they stand to benefit from aggressive tax incentives, subsidies, and government support. And the US isn't the only country trying to shape its future. China has become a far more formidable competitor to the United States, and this hasn't happened by accident. For years, the Chinese government has deliberately directed enormous resources towards gaining dominance in key industries and critical bottlenecks across the global supply chain. Just look at their 5-year plan. In industries like new energy vehicle, China hasn't just met its strategic targets, it's blown right past them. So if you want to position your portfolio more aggressively, one place to look is in these emerging industries, areas where uncertainty is higher, but the potential upside is also enormous. At the same time, it's fair to admit that many of us retail investors naturally gravitate towards sectors or industries that feel familiar, like software companies or retail products that we've interacted with. After all, many of us took Peter Lynch's famous advice, invest in what you know, to heart. But the next decade may require a shift in our mindset, because the industries shaping the future may not be the ones we've grown comfortable analyzing. And if that happens, software, which has dominated the market for so long, may no longer offer the same returns we've gotten used to. If we look at the IGV Tech Services ETF, this has been in a downward spiral over the past 6 months. But recently, some of that selling pressure appears to be slowing down, with retail investors purchasing aggressively at these levels, something we haven't really seen in the past 5 years. So the market now seems to be split into two camps: those that believe AI is going to be disrupting many traditional software businesses, and those that believe many of these businesses are actually AI immune or AI beneficiaries. But regardless of which side you're on, it's clear that we're entering into a new AI era. As you might expect, a lot of companies and startups are trying to capitalize on this moment. Interestingly, data from Citadel suggests that software hiring is actually increasing, specifically at the software engineer level. And this runs somewhat counter to the broader narrative around AI, which has suggested that the overall software workforce may shrink over time. Instead, what we might be seeing is a reshuffling of roles with growing demand for positions such as software engineers, machine learning engineers, and prompt engineers. Because of this shift, it may become increasingly useful for investors to pay attention to per employee metrics, such as revenue per employee and free cash flow per employee. So why would these two metrics be useful? Well, they help us look at the problem from both ends of the AI equation. On one hand, companies are trying to scale and gain traction with their AI-based products, which is why looking at revenue per employee can be helpful. It tells us how effectively a company is generating output relative to its workforce. On the other hand, we also want to understand how much efficiency AI is creating inside the organization. So if companies are able to automate workflows or reduce headcount, that should eventually show up in the higher free cash flow per employee metric. One practical way investors might screen for this is by looking at companies with unusually high selling and general administrative expenses relative to their revenue, which could indicate potential cost-cutting opportunities ahead. Jack Dorsey recently reduced headcount at Block by around 40%, highlighting how companies are beginning to rethink their workforce around AI-driven environments. But should we really be diving in headfirst into this AI wave, investing across both the infrastructure layer and the software layer? Well, probably not. And for a little perspective on why, we can look no further than to Warren Buffett. Since inception, Berkshire Hathaway has delivered a compounded annual growth rate of roughly 20% a year, making it one of the greatest long-term investments ever. And if you compare that to returns of the S&P 500 over that same period, the S&P compounded annually at around 10% a year. So you can understand why there is so much admiration and awe for the magnitude of outperformance that he has achieved in his lifetime. And importantly, that success didn't come from trying to time entries and exits around the latest investment themes. And just to be clear, when I talk about thematic investments or investment themes, I'm not referring to the typical definition you might see in thematic ETFs that allow investors to simply ride a trend. But what I'm suggesting instead is something different, more like identifying one or two exceptional companies that are well positioned to benefit from long-term tailwinds. So what made Berkshire so great is the company didn't rely on a single investment theme, and instead it became the original serial acquirer, a business whose model is simply to acquire other high-quality companies. As long as Berkshire can continue acquiring businesses at attractive rates of return, it can keep growing revenue and earnings through inorganic growth. In other words, through acquisitions. And that highlights the key principles we should keep in mind when thinking about thematic investments in AI. It's not about chasing the theme itself, but about identifying the specific businesses that can generate the strongest returns from it. And here's what the Oracle of Omaha had to say on the subject of new investment opportunities all the way back in 1985 from his annual shareholder letter. Over the years, we had the option of making large capital expenditures in the textile operation that would have allowed us to somewhat reduce variable costs. Each proposal to do so looked like an immediate winner, but the promised benefits from these textile investments were illusory. Many of our competitors, both domestic and foreign, were stepping up to the same kind of expenditures. Once enough companies did so, their reduced costs became the baseline for reduced prices industry-wide. Viewed individually, each company's capital investment decisions appeared cost-effective and rational. Viewed collectively, the decisions neutralized each other and were irrational, just as happens when each person watching a parade decides he can see a little bit better if he stands on tiptoes. After each round of investment, all the players had money in the game and the returns remained anemic. And this feels so similar to what might be happening right now in AI. All the hyperscalers are investing heavily and at the same time into this new technology, in what might be one of the clearest examples of the prisoner's dilemma we've seen in a long time. And also, software companies are hiring more engineers, and as the cost per token for large language models continues to fall, the cost for delivering AI powered software services will likely fall as well. When you combine that with the productivity gains from AI, it means that the supply of software could expand dramatically. And as supply grows, that could ultimately put downward pressure on software prices. It feels almost like software is starting to become commoditized. We've already seen this happen around the LLM layer, where large language models from companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google are rapidly converging in capability. And the real question now is whether the same kind of commoditization moves further up the stack into the software layer. So, therefore, should we take Warren Buffett's advice and avoid this new technological revolution altogether? Well, here's what Howard Marks had to say from his latest memo in regards to AI. Since no one can definitively say whether this is a bubble, I'd advise that no one should go all in without acknowledging that they face the risk of ruin if things go badly. By the same token, no one should stay all out and risk missing out on one of the greatest technological steps forward. A moderate position applied selectively with prudence seems like the best approach. And I really like how Howard Marks is embracing the AI wave, so to speak. Because even the great Warren Buffett himself and Charlie Munger admit that they missed out on Google because they couldn't make sense of it at the time. And as a thank you for sticking around so far, let me give you an example of a company that I believe to be AI resilient or possibly an AI beneficiary. And that company is Bentley Systems. Bentley develops software used to design and model large infrastructure projects, things like roads, rail networks, bridges, and data centers. And as we discussed earlier, infrastructure spending is likely to accelerate over the coming decade. The company has delivered steady revenue growth of around 11% annually. But more importantly, it generates strong and growing free cash flow. So this is a relatively low risk bet, but the key point here is that the infrastructure software is often mission critical. When you're designing bridges, rail systems, or power grids, the tolerance for error is extremely small, which could make this the type of business that is far more resilient to AI disruption. Now, to be clear, this isn't a buy or sell recommendation, and it's just an example of a type of company that may be better positioned in an AI world. And I'd love to hear from you guys if you have any companies that you believe are going to be AI winners, or even if they're just infrastructure winners overall. So, what's the key takeaway from all this rambling? Well, I guess you could say is that you should be extremely selective moving forward. The sectors that dominated the last decade may not be the ones that dominate the next. And the markets or countries that drove the biggest returns in the past may not be where those returns come from in the future. And at the same time, there will almost certainly be companies that emerge from this new AI era and reshoring that will capture enormous market share. The goal of this video wasn't to tell you exactly what to buy or sell, but rather to offer a framework of thinking about how to position your portfolio so it can remain resilient, whether the environment ahead calls for being more aggressive or more defensive. And I'll leave you with this quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald that I think can capture this idea perfectly. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do drop a like and subscribe for more finance and stock-related content. And until next time, take care.